When I bought the house 2 years ago, I thought it was a step toward independence. At 25, I was proud to call myself a homeowner. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Close to my job as a programmer, it was convenient and perfect. My parents, Sarah and Tom, had just retired and were looking for a stable place to settle. Offering them a space in my new house felt like the right thing to do. They had supported me through college, and I wanted to return the favor. From the beginning, I covered all the expenses. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, you name it. My parents insisted they didn't want to be a burden, but their limited retirement income didn't leave them with much choice. At first, everything ran smoothly. I worked long hours, and they maintained the home. It was a peaceful balance, until last month. Sarah came into the living room one evening and announced, without hesitation, that my older brother Jason and his pregnant wife Emma would be moving in. She said it was just for a while until they got back on their feet. My stomach dropped. Jason, the golden child, had always been a point of tension. While I slogged through college and saved every penny, he bounced from one failed business venture to another, always expecting someone else to pick up the pieces. Before I could say anything, Sarah reassured me it would be temporary. Jason had lost his latest job, and Emma's pregnancy meant they needed support. I wanted to protest, but the guilt trips began before I could form the words. Their family, she said. Where else can they go? A week later, Jason and Emma arrived. They didn't come with just a few suitcases, they brought an entire moving truck. Furniture, boxes, and even their dog spilled into the house. The guest room I had prepared for emergencies was immediately filled, and within days, the hallways felt cramped. Emma's pregnancy became the excuse for every inconvenience. Jason demanded I help carry their furniture, claiming Emma couldn't lift a finger. Sarah fussed over them constantly, treating them like royalty. Then came the request that pushed me over the edge. Jason sat me down, his tone overly casual, and suggested I swap rooms with them. My master bedroom, he argued, was larger and had an attached bathroom, which would be perfect for Emma during her pregnancy. I stared at him, dumbfounded. I had worked for years to afford this house, sacrificing sleep and social life to make the down payment. Now, my brother, who hadn't contributed a dime, wanted to take over the best part of it. The worst part was my parents' reaction. Instead of backing me up, they sided with Jason. Emma's pregnant, Sarah said, as if that was the ultimate justification. Tom nodded along, saying it was the right thing to do. My objections were dismissed as selfishness. The guilt was unbearable. Was I being unreasonable for wanting to keep the space I had earned? The resentment began to boil inside me. To make matters worse, Jason and Emma's presence disrupted my entire routine. They occupied the kitchen for hours, leaving dishes in the sink and crumbs on every surface. Their dog, an untrained ball of energy, chewed on furniture and barked at all hours. Jason monopolized the TV, blasting shows late into the night, while Emma made constant demands. Whether it was a craving for a specific meal or a complaint about the temperature, nothing was ever good enough. I started coming home later and later, just to avoid the chaos. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a battleground, and I was losing ground with every passing day. My frustration grew, but every time I tried to address it, Sarah played the family card. Family helps family, she would say, her tone dripping with disappointment. Tom would nod silently, avoiding eye contact. The final straw came when I discovered Jason had been snooping through my office. My work laptop, papers, and personal documents had been moved. When I confronted him, he brushed it off, saying he was just looking for the Wi-Fi password. It felt like an invasion of privacy, a clear line crossed. Yet, when I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed it as a misunderstanding. He didn't mean any harm, Sarah said. I couldn't shake the feeling that my house, my sanctuary, was slipping away from me. The walls that once felt like protection now felt like they were closing in. Jason and Emma had turned my life upside down, and my parents seemed blind to the impact it was having on me. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, and I knew something had to change. The question was, how far was I willing to go to reclaim what was mine? The tension in the house escalated quickly. One evening, I returned from work to find Emma in my bedroom. She was sorting through my belongings, piling my clothes into plastic bins as if they were clutter to be discarded. The sight froze me in my tracks. My desk, my bed, my carefully organized shelves, it was all being dismantled. She didn't even acknowledge me at first, humming softly as she worked. When I finally found my voice to ask what she was doing, her response was casual and dismissive. She said it was better for everyone if they moved into the master bedroom sooner rather than later. The words hit like a punch. Without permission, without even a conversation, she had taken it upon herself to decide where I belonged in my own home. My protests were met with the same excuse I had grown sick of hearing: her pregnancy. Apparently, every boundary could be crossed, every rule ignored, as long as it was framed as a necessity for the baby. I was furious, but before I could fully process what was happening, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She didn't defend me. Instead, she sided with Emma, insisting that it was just practical. The larger room, the attached bathroom, the quieter part of the house, all of it, Sarah argued, was better suited for a pregnant woman. Her tone was calm, almost patronizing, as if I was the unreasonable one for objecting. She even went so far as to accuse me of being selfish, of not thinking about what was best for the family. The feeling of betrayal deepened. I had opened my home to them, sacrificed my space and my comfort, and this was the thanks I got. When I firmly told them to stop and leave my things alone, Emma's expression shifted. She didn't look apologetic or embarrassed. She looked annoyed, as if I was inconveniencing her by standing up for myself. Jason, who had been lurking in the living room, joined the scene, and instead of diffusing the situation, he backed up Emma. The entitlement was astounding. Jason claimed that I was overreacting and that Emma's needs should take precedence. He brushed off my concerns about privacy, ownership, and respect, painting me as a petty, uncompromising figure. The smug look on his face made my blood boil. It was clear they saw no issue with their actions, no need to show gratitude or respect. I stood my ground. I told them the master bedroom was off limits. My parents, Jason, and Emma acted as if I had declared war. The atmosphere in the house shifted after that. Every interaction became strained. Emma made passive-aggressive comments about how the house was not set up for a family, while Jason made himself even more comfortable, using my office as his personal space without asking. Sarah, instead of mediating, doubled down on her support for Jason and Emma, urging me to look at the bigger picture and act like the head of the family. It felt like a coordinated effort to push me into submission. Meals became a battleground, with Emma dictating what should be cooked and Jason helping himself to the groceries I bought without so much as a thank you. Their dog, already an untrained menace, was now allowed to roam freely, leaving messes everywhere. When I brought up any of these issues, the responses were always dismissive. Emma claimed she was too exhausted to help, and Jason laughed off my concerns as trivial. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being systematically edged out of my own home. The guest room they occupied was overflowing with their belongings, but that didn't stop them from encroaching on every other part of the house. My parents' attitude only made it worse. They refused to see my side of things, framing Jason and Emma's behavior as a temporary adjustment. The breaking point came one evening when I returned to find my belongings stacked haphazardly in the hallway. They had gone ahead with their plan, moving my things out of the master bedroom without my permission. I felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. It wasn't just the physical invasion of my space, it was the complete disregard for my boundaries, my hard work, and my role as the owner of the house. That night, I lay awake in the cramped guest room, staring at the ceiling. My parents' muffled voices came from their room, discussing how everything will settle down soon. Jason and Emma's laughter echoed from the master bedroom, now fully theirs. The house I had worked so hard for had become unrecognizable. I felt like a guest in my own home, an outsider among people who should have been my support system. It was clear that my passive approach wasn't working. The more I allowed them to take, the more they demanded. I had tried to be accommodating, to keep the peace, but it had only encouraged their entitlement. As I lay there, a resolve began to form. If they thought they could walk all over me, they were in for a surprise. My patience had run out, and it was time to take back control of my life and my home. I just needed to figure out how to do it without tearing the family apart. The morning after my belongings were shoved into the hallway, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, tiptoeing around my own home and letting my family dictate my life. It was time to set boundaries, and this time, they would be enforced. During my lunch break at work, I contacted a lawyer. Explaining the situation felt surreal, but I didn't leave out any details. By the end of the conversation, I had a clear path forward. I could start eviction proceedings for Jason, Emma, and even my parents if it came to that. Drafting the documents was both cathartic and nerve-wracking. The lawyer assured me that as the sole owner of the house, I had every legal right to reclaim my space. Still, the thought of serving my own family with eviction notices made my stomach churn. I wasn't heartless, but I had reached my limit. They had left me no choice. That evening, I arrived home to find Emma lounging in the living room, her feet propped up on the coffee table, scrolling through her phone. Jason was nowhere to be seen, likely in my office again. Sarah and Tom were in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones. The tension in the air was palpable. I knew that what I was about to do would make things worse before they got better, but I couldn't delay any longer. I handed the documents to Jason first. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He accused me of being cruel, selfish, and heartless. Emma joined in, her voice sharp and cutting. She framed herself as the victim, emphasizing her pregnancy at every turn. According to her, I was a monster for even considering putting a pregnant woman out on the street. Her words were designed to guilt me, but I held firm. When I presented the same documents to my parents, the betrayal in their eyes was unmistakable. Sarah's voice trembled as she defended Jason, saying he had always been weaker and in need of support. She painted a picture of Jason as a struggling man who had never quite found his footing, as if that somehow justified his actions. Tom, as usual, said little, but his disappointment was clear. They couldn't understand how I could turn on my own family. But I wasn't turning on them. I was standing up for myself. I explained that this wasn't about Emma's pregnancy or Jason's shortcomings. It was about respect, boundaries, and the simple fact that this was my home. I had worked tirelessly to provide for them, and they had taken advantage of my generosity. My parents tried to reason with me, urging me to reconsider, but their words fell flat. They couldn't see past their loyalty to Jason, and I couldn't ignore the damage their favoritism had caused. The house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Jason and Emma's outrage turned into a full-blown tantrum, complete with accusations and thinly veiled threats. Emma claimed I was putting her unborn child at risk, painting me as a villain to anyone who would listen. Jason, ever the opportunist, tried to rally Sarah and Tom to his side, framing me as the ungrateful son who had abandoned his family. Despite the noise, I remained calm. I laid out the ultimatum clearly. They had 24 hours to decide. Either they agreed to live under my rules, respecting my boundaries and my authority as the homeowner, or they would have to leave. The terms were non-negotiable. I could see the disbelief in their faces, as if they couldn't fathom that I'd actually go through with it. But I was done being the pushover. That night, the house was eerily quiet. Jason and Emma retreated to the master bedroom, their whispers muffled but urgent. My parents stayed in their room, likely discussing how to salvage the situation. I tried to focus on anything else, but my thoughts kept circling back to the confrontation. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve, but I reminded myself why I was doing this. My home had become a battleground, and I couldn't keep living under siege. The next morning, the tension was thicker than ever. Emma made a show of her discomfort, sighing dramatically and holding her stomach as if to remind me of her pregnancy. Jason avoided eye contact, his jaw clenched. Sarah and Tom looked at me with a mixture of sadness and disapproval. It was clear they had expected me to fold under the pressure, but I hadn't. I left for work with the finality of my decision hanging in the air. As I drove, I couldn't help but wonder what I would return to. Would they pack up and leave? Would they double down on their entitlement? The uncertainty was exhausting, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't back down. This was my home, my life, and it was time I took control of both. The deadline loomed over the house like an impending storm. I had spent the day steeling myself for what was to come, knowing that the hours ahead would be pivotal. When I returned home that evening, the air inside was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Jason and Emma were packing their things in the master bedroom, their hushed voices carrying an edge of bitterness. The guest room where I had been relegated was untouched, and I could see they had no intention of making this process easy. Jason's face was a storm cloud when he saw me. He barely acknowledged my presence, instead focusing on the slow, deliberate task of packing. Emma, ever the dramatist, made a show of sighing and clutching her stomach as if the act of moving was an unbearable burden. The resentment was palpable, but I didn't engage. I had made my stance clear, and nothing they said or did would change that. Hours passed as they loaded their belongings into their car, taking their time as though they wanted me to feel the weight of their departure. Emma's dog barked incessantly, a fitting soundtrack to the chaos. My parents hovered nearby, their faces etched with worry. Sarah occasionally tried to help Jason, offering soothing words that only seemed to fuel his anger. Tom kept to himself, his silence speaking volumes. Finally, the moment came. Jason and Emma stood at the door, their expressions a mixture of anger and wounded pride. They didn't say goodbye. Instead, Jason muttered something under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Emma followed, her head held high despite the tears welling in her eyes. Their car disappeared down the street, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt still. The quiet didn't last long. Sarah and Tom retreated to the kitchen, and I knew what was coming. Sure enough, Sarah approached me, her face lined with weariness. She didn't launch into an argument or a plea, though. Instead, she admitted they had misjudged the situation. Her voice was softer than I'd heard in years, carrying an unfamiliar note of regret. She acknowledged that their insistence on accommodating Jason and Emma had been unfair to me. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, but it was a start. I took the opportunity to explain my perspective, laying everything out on the table. I spoke about the years of feeling overshadowed by Jason, the sacrifices I had made to provide for the family, and the complete lack of respect I had been shown in return. I wasn't trying to score points or assign blame, I just needed them to understand. Sarah listened, and for the first time, it seemed like my words were sinking in. She admitted that she and Tom had placed too much pressure on me, assuming I could handle it without complaint. She confessed that they had relied on my stability to compensate for Jason's shortcomings, never stopping to consider how that might affect me. Her eyes welled up with tears as she spoke, and I could see the weight of her guilt. Tom, ever the quiet observer, finally chimed in. He admitted that he had stayed silent for too long, letting Sarah take the lead in decisions that had clearly been wrong. He didn't offer excuses, only an acknowledgement that they had failed to treat me as an equal member of the family. His words were few, but they carried a sincerity that I hadn't expected. I told them both that I wasn't angry anymore, but I couldn't go back to the way things were. I needed respect, boundaries, and a home that felt like mine again. If they wanted to stay, they would have to accept that. I wasn't a tool to be used for their convenience, and I wouldn't allow myself to be manipulated by guilt or familial obligations. Sarah's shoulders sagged as she nodded. She promised to do better, to respect my rules and my space. It wasn't an instant fix, but it felt genuine. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my voice had been heard. Tom agreed, adding that they would start contributing more, both financially and in maintaining the household. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. That night, the house was quiet in a way that felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Jason and Emma's departure had left a void, but it was one I welcomed. As I sat in the living room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my home, I finally felt a sense of relief. The battles of the past weeks had taken their toll, but I had stood my ground. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was reclaiming my life. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There were still wounds to heal and dynamics to rebuild. But for now, I was content with the small victory I had achieved. I had taken a stand, and in doing so, I had found my voice. And that, more than anything, felt like a step in the right direction. The house felt different in the days following Jason and Emma's departure. The once oppressive atmosphere had lifted, leaving behind an unfamiliar calm. I was no longer walking on eggshells or bracing for the next argument. For the first time in weeks, I could relax in my own home without the constant undercurrent of tension. It was a welcome change, though it left a strange, almost eerie quiet in its wake. Sarah and Tom's behavior shifted noticeably. Whether it was the shock of Jason's departure or the gravity of our conversation, something had clicked. Sarah began taking on small household tasks she hadn't bothered with before, like washing dishes after meals or tidying up shared spaces. Tom started helping with repairs around the house, fixing a leaky faucet that had been dripping for months and tackling the creaky floorboards in the hallway. These weren't grand gestures, but they were meaningful. For the first time, it felt like they were trying to be partners in maintaining the home instead of passive occupants. Their attitudes toward me also softened. Sarah stopped making excuses for Jason and Emma, instead acknowledging the strain their presence had placed on me. Tom, usually a man of few words, began asking if there was anything I needed or offering to help with errands. It wasn't perfect, years of ingrained dynamics don't change overnight, but it was a start. I could see they were making an effort, and for now, that was enough. I took the newfound peace as an opportunity to focus on myself. My work as a programmer had suffered during the chaos, with late nights and endless stress taking a toll on my productivity. Now, I could finally throw myself back into my projects, rediscovering the sense of purpose that had been buried under layers of family drama. I also made time for small joys I had neglected, like reading, cooking for pleasure rather than necessity, and catching up with friends. Slowly, I felt my emotional balance returning. Despite the progress at home, my relationship with Jason and Emma remained strained. Weeks passed without contact, and I found myself feeling ambivalent about it. On one hand, the silence was a relief. On the other, there was a lingering sadness. Jason was my brother, and no matter how toxic things had become, there was a part of me that missed the bond we had shared as kids. But I knew better than to let nostalgia cloud my judgment. The damage they had done wasn't something I could easily forgive, let alone forget. One evening, as I was unwinding with a book, I received an email from Jason. The subject line was simple: "I'm sorry." My heart raced as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. The message was brief, uncharacteristically so for Jason. He admitted he had been wrong, acknowledged the strain he and Emma had caused, and apologized for taking advantage of my generosity. He promised to do better and ended with a hope that we could rebuild our relationship someday. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading his words. It wasn't the dramatic, tearful apology I might have envisioned, but it felt genuine. For a moment, I considered responding, reaching out to bridge the gap that had grown between us. But then I remembered the months of entitlement, manipulation, and outright disrespect. I thought about the chaos they had brought into my life and the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. Could I trust that this time would be different? Ultimately, I decided not to reply. It wasn't out of spite or lingering anger but out of self-preservation. I had learned the hard way that some boundaries are necessary, even with family. Rebuilding a relationship with Jason might be possible someday, but it wasn't something I was ready to pursue. For now, distance felt like the healthiest choice. Life settled into a new rhythm. Sarah and Tom continued to adjust, their efforts to contribute becoming more consistent. They even began discussing plans to downsize and move into a smaller place of their own eventually, recognizing that I deserved my independence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. The house felt like mine again, not just in ownership but in spirit. Looking back, I knew this experience had changed me. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my family and myself. I had always prided myself on being the dependable one, the one who held everything together. But this ordeal taught me the importance of standing up for myself, of setting boundaries even when it was painful. It wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one I'd carry with me. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The battles of the past weeks were behind me, and while there were still scars, they no longer felt raw. I had reclaimed my home, my life, and my sense of self. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to move forward, not as the family's fixer but as my own person.